Sure. So, hello everyone. Good afternoon. So, welcome to our Friday transportation seminar series to both in-class and online audience. I'm Xiaoping Li, and I'm a facilitator for this seminar series. And this series is being sponsored by uh, student IT student chapter, as well as the several university transportation centers, CTEC, NICER, and TomNet. And also, we appreciate help from Carter and our CEE department. So today, we're very fortunate to have renowned scholar, Dr. Marco Nia, to give us a talk. And he is currently a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Northwestern University. And actually, I know him while I was an undergraduate student because we attended the same college, and he left lots of success stories over there. Um, and now he's actually uh, attended and he's got degrees from Tsinghua University, National University of Singapore, and PhD from UC Davis. And his work covers a variety of topics in the area of transportation systems and analysis, economics, and sustainable transportation. So and he's very successful in terms of serving editorial board on many renowned journals, and also producing uh, students at top universities across the world. And also, I like the solidity of his work in terms of analytics. So he's going to talk about something very interesting about Dockless Bikesharing systems, which are also available in downtown Tampa, I guess. I'm sure he's going to talk about a very elegant analytical model, Parsimonious. I want to draw your attention to this word. I remember Dr. Mike Cassidy, when he made a presentation, he used the same word again. I hope that's a really elegant way of looking into system. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Nia for that nice talk.
Thank you, Xiaopeng, for your nice introduction and invitation. It's good to be here. I believe it's my first time to visit your lovely campus. I don't know. I always welcome opportunity to get away from Chicago during the springtime, because spring there, I'm sure most of you know, is terrible. It's very depressing. So whenever there's opportunity, I'll be happy to leave Chicago during the springtime. Anyway, so today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to present a study about Dockless Bikesharing system. This is a joint work with my graduate students and two collaborators from China who shared us with the data. Well, so to put our study in perspective, I think I should start a brief review of the history of bikesharing. Okay. Most the literature generally trace the origin of bike sharing to the so-called white bicycle plying, launched in Amsterdam in 1960s. Right. So the idea of white bicycle plying was quite simple. So you find a old bicycle and you paint it white, and you leave the bicycles on the streets for people to use. So the the white bicycle plying was a grassroots movement that was driven by radical anarchists, right? So it was as much a political statement as a transportation project. In fact, the movement was short-lived because the government never approved it. In fact, many of these bikes were removed by police. Okay, so that was a history of the first generation bike sharing. But then bike sharing made a comeback in 1990s in Copenhagen in Denmark, and with three innovations. In the second generation, they used distinguished design of bikes. They also introduced docks that can, lock the bikes away. that helps with the safety deterrence. They also introduced a coin deposit system so that you could also help with payment and also help with security. Finally, in 2000, the third generation emerged in Lyon, France, where they use smart technology like credit card payment, smartphone, to take care of many of the operations, ranging from payment system and safety deterrence. They also introduce membership so that you can charge people with a subscription fee. Well, so if you look at the history of bike sharing, you realize that the docks actually were a very important invention. Docks provide a place for you to store and secure the bikes, right? When the bikes are not in use, and docks also allow the operators to automatically collect the payment, right? And that was very critical to the financial viability of the system. But docks are also very expensive, right? According to one study done by Susan Shahin, I think she did that 10 years ago, perhaps. She estimated that each bike station cost as much as $40,000, and each additional dock will cost $3,000 more. Okay, so this cost severely restricts the freedom of growth of the system, right? The high cost basically by limiting the number of stations and stops, I mean, and the docks, it limits the scale of the system, undermines the level of service, and that also undermines the appeal of the system, right? The scarcity the scarcity also means the operators must be very carefully select the locations to place the bikes in order to maximize the use and revenue, and that often resulting inequitable access and therefore outcry about equity issues. So that brings us to the idea of doing away with bikes, right? So the first large-scale Dockless bike sharing system was launched on a college campus in Beijing, China, in 2014 by a startup called OFO. I'm sure there was other programs before OFO launched this program, but those are compared in terms of scale, those are much smaller. The Dockless bike sharing features bikes that are tracked by GPS sensors, right? And the bikes can be locked, unlocked, and paid for or through an app on your smartphone. Another feature I think that's very useful that you can actually search for bikes on your smartphone. So you can literally say where the bikes are, and in fact the bike can even can guide you to find the bike. Last but not least, I think this is perhaps the most appealing feature of Dockless bike sharing is that you can take bikes wherever you find them, and most importantly, you can leave them wherever you like it. Okay, so that was very, very convenient for users. Shortly after the launch of OFO, the bike sharing, especially Dockless bike sharing, went through a exponential growth phase that was staggering, even by Chinese standard. Okay, the two flagship startups, the OFO and Mobac, raised close to $1 billion in a matter of a few years, right? And they each gained a evaluation almost 3 times of a unicorn. So they each have a valuation and its peak about $3 billion. And the fleet size of bike sharing in China increased almost 10,000-fold in 3 years, and it reached to over 20 million by 2018. And at its peak in 2018, the ridership reached 70 million per day. Okay, so that's a tremendous growth in 3 years. So why you wonder why there was such a tremendous interest in bike sharing, right? Because if you think about it, no matter how you cut it, bike sharing is really relatively small. They play a relatively small role in the entire transportation enterprise. So why everybody likes it? I think travelers like DLB, the Dockless Bikesharing, because it is convenient and it is affordable, right? Cities love bike sharing because it is green and it's sustainable. Business like it because this program offers a gateway to what appears to be a very large consumer base. Right? So they think through the bike sharing apps, they could get access to that consumer base. Academics love it because of the big data, right? The new type of big data or mobility data that the system promised to deliver. Finally, the venture capitalists also love it because it appears that the system can be easily scaled up, and therefore they can make a very quick money. Okay, so in retrospect, I think the end of the 2017 was the heyday of bike sharing system at least in China. Okay, the soon after 2017, you can see the the market begins to cool. The number of active users began to drop, and the venture capital begins to dry out. Okay, most of the startups, and at peak, I think there's 30, 40 startups doing this business. Most of the startup failed, okay, in few years, including OFO, which literally was the icon of the industry. Okay, another giant Mobike was acquired by Meituan in 2018. So most of them failed. And you wonder what happened, why they quickly failed. I think much of the fiasco can be attributed to the mentality of winner take all, right? Of course, competition for dominance or monopoly is nothing new in business, and it's happening every day, everywhere. But unfortunately, bike sharing is really not a market in which monopoly can be easily maintained or achieved because it has such a low market entry barrier. So you don't really have the technology can be easily replicated by competitors. So you don't really have a barrier to fend off competitors. The only weapon a startup that they have to get rid of their competitors is the scale of their fleet. Okay, so they try to scale up because they think if you have a larger fleet, they can provide more convenience and therefore they can fend off their competitors. So it's not a surprise that this competition eventually lead to a supply that was so excessive that can only be described as self-destructive. Okay, and I'm sure many of you still remember the news where there's so much outcry in almost every big cities there, about the public space being occupied and really littered by bikes, and the startups, because they have such massive fleets, they really struggle to maintain and repair them. They cannot properly maintain their fleets. Finally, as a very unpleasant surprise, I'm sure to them, they realize very quickly they cannot just buy a lot of bikes and leave them on the street for people to use. They had to actively move the bikes around so that people can actually use them. Okay. And the cost of rebalancing, I'm sure many of the startups were caught off guard by this cost because the cost is actually quite high. Okay. And they never saw the need to pay for that. They saw they just buy bikes and put it out there. People will use them, and everything and they will just collect money. Wasn't like that. So what we have learned, what lessons we learned? I think the most important lesson that we learned is that even when it comes to such good stuff as bike sharing, more is not always better, right? Having learned that lesson hard way and firsthand, China began to regulate their market very tightly and mostly to limit the number of operators and the size of their fleets. Okay, and U.S. having seen what happened in China, U.S. was more careful to admit micro-mobility service providers into their cities, and especially they have tight limitations on the fleet, how many units are allowed in a city. Another lesson that we learned is that regulation is actually not easy to come by, right? Even just simple regulation, like how many bikes you would allow in a particular city is actually not easy to. It's hard to come up with a number that is meaningful and is reasonable. And that's because in order to do that, you need to have a good understanding of the complex supply-demand interactions on the marketplace. You also need to balance the competing interests of different stakeholders, travelers, city, and operator. And in fact, we don't think there's a there's no tools. There are no tools that are readily deployable that you can just grab and use it to answer that question. So having made this very long, lengthy introduction, let me just put my research question out there. That question actually literally was bothering me for quite a long time. I mean, I went back. I was in China quite a lot in the year, at the peak of the bike sharing. I keep wondering, why, is there any way that we could quickly figure out, the proper size and the price of the bike sharing system in a city. And this could be useful for the operator who wants to get into a particular market. This could also be useful for planner who seeks to maximize the social welfare, right? So how can we come up with idea, something that we can answer that question quickly? Okay, that was our question. So we're gonna try to answer this question by develop a parsimonious model of the DLB market that would do two things. First of all, we'll try to indulge in as travelers' mode choice. And we'll also consider key bike operations, including rebalancing. Okay. Let me first give you a sort of a 10,000 feet view of our model. So we're gonna, on the demand side, we will allow travelers to choose travel mode based on cost. And the DOB cost, the bike sharing cost will be determined by only two variables, fleet size and the price. On the supply side, we are going to try to determine the access time, the time that you need to find a bike, but define the level of service. We're going to allow the access cost, define level of service. And finally, we will model the rebalancing cost. We'll model the rebalancing cost as a function of bike usage. And we will also calibrate our model against the data we collect in Chengdu, China, and we'll test it against what's going on in Chengdu, and we'll compare what our model says and what's going on the ground. And we'll test the three counterfactuals, right? We'll test basically the benchmark, what is happening in Chengdu, but we'll also test what if you want to maximize the profit, what if you want to maximize ridership, what if you want to maximize social fare. So you would take different perspective. Without giving you a very long literature review, I just want to summarize what we think is new in this particular study. The paper is online. If you're interested in literature review, you can read it there. I think one thing that we are doing, I think is new, is that we're taking the perspective of a regulator. Most of the literature, they take the perspective of the operator, okay? We consider the sort of interaction between different modes, DLB and other modes. We also consider a joint design of pricing and fleet. So we put pricing into the consideration. Many of the literature, the studies that we read from the literature, they don't necessarily try to optimize pricing. And also I think we develop a simple model that will promise, you can do the back of the envelope solution. This is figuratively, okay? I'm not suggesting you can actually write our model on the back of envelope and actually solve it. You can't. You still have to use computer, but still, our model, I think, is much simpler than most of the models that you will find in the literature, because most of the models in the literature are network models. I'm sure Professor Zhang here, she has done a lot of research, and then we read your work. But I think it's fair to say many of those models are happen to be harder to solve because they're by nature the NP hard problems. Whereas we are trying to develop a simpler model, and of course those models serve completely different purposes. Well, having said that, now let me try to introduce a model, explain the model quickly. And when you want to develop a very simple model, you necessarily need a lot of assumptions. Okay, so I'm going to share those assumptions. I try to make them as transparent as possible, and we can then discuss whether or not you think those assumptions are reasonable. So the first assumption we have to make is that we assume the travelers' origin destinations are uniformly distributed. Okay, and we also assume that they can only choose one of the three modes: the walking, biking, and a composite model that is motorized model. Okay. Now, I think it's obvious that uniform distribution assumption is very strong and it's unlikely to hold in reality. And we think the impact of that assumption on our results is that you could easily overestimate the appeal of bike sharing, and we can underestimate the cost of rebalancing, right? So we have to keep that caveat in mind, that we are actually, whatever we come up with here is most likely overestimate the appeal of bike sharing because of that assumption. Now, we drive our demand using mode choice. Now there are three modes, okay? We consider walking. So walking doesn't have a fixed cost because you don't really need to pay anything to walk. So walking has a fixed cost, no fixed cost, but it has a very high variable cost. So your cost will rise quickly as your trip length increase. So that's walking. Now, biking has a medium fixed cost and medium variable cost, right? Finally, the driving have a high fixed cost and low variable cost. So now it's very natural. Now you can see that bike is competitive in the middle. So when the trip length is the middle range, biking is competitive. And this line representing the trip length distribution of the city. So we assume that you can come up with the trip length distribution, and therefore say this area will represent the share of bike. So that's the demand for bike sharing. So using this model, you can sort of make your demand for biking be sensitive to the design parameters, like what I represent here, FB, that is a fare per unit distance travel on biking, and A, that is access cost. So this demand function drive is driven by the mode choice. Now, on the supply side, an important concept that we introduced is unique biking location. So now if you look at all these bikes distributed in the space, we assume that these bikes can be aggregated into so-called unique bike locations. And those unique bike locations themselves are uniformly distributed in space. And we also assume that the density of these locations is increasing and a concave function of the bike density. So we assume that you could convert the density of bike into the density of the locations. And we propose to do this to find the function form using data. So we're going to cluster the bikes to locations, and then we use a regression to find out the functional form. So that's an important idea in terms of addressing access time. So with unique location, now you could estimate access time. So imagine the person sitting in the middle. It's a random person. It can appear anywhere. Now with that, once you know the density of the unique location, you can estimate what would be the average time that you need to reach the nearest unique location using this formula. This is a widely used formula in the literature. Carlos Ganzo was perhaps, among others, is a person who have popularized the use of this formula. Okay, so if you know the density of the unique location here is Antioida, you can then use this formula to estimate how much time a person will need to find a bike in your system. Now, rebalancing is a tricky thing. Okay, rebalancing is hard to do, and here's what we do. We have to introduce the assumption. The assumption is the following. So we assume that whenever a bike trip takes place, it would generate a certain rebalancing trips. We're going to call it alpha. Alpha is a number smaller than 1. And that trip would also result in a loss of certain unique locations. So a certain percentage of unique locations will be lost. And so the idea is that then you have to use rebalancing trips to replenish, if you wish, the lost unique locations to keep the system at a balanced state. Okay. And we assume that the ratio of the two, which is alpha and sigma, have to be equals to ratio between the unique location and the number of bikes. Okay. So now, how do we get sigma and alpha, you ask, right? So we know Antilda, which is the unique location. We have no n, which is bike location. We can actually estimate, we can actually observe alpha. We have observed alpha before. Using the Chicago data, we actually observe alpha is roughly 0.1, which means, by the way, if you rebalance, if you move bike once, that bike will generate 10 more trips. So each rebalancing will generate 10 productive trips. In the case of Chengdu, we found that this number is 0.2, which means every rebalancing will generate 5 more trips. So in Chengdu, the rebalancing efficiency is lower than in Chicago. But anyway, if you know alpha, if you know Antilda, if you in fact, you can estimate what is sigma. The idea is that you always rebalancing to make sure the ratio between unique location and bike are roughly the same. Okay. Well, so once you have that, once you have sigma, QB is a number of bike trips, right? QB is a variable, is a number of bike trips generated from the demand model. If you use that to multiply sigma, this tells you how many unique bike locations you need to replenish. And that will tell you on average how long each bike needs to be moved. Okay, so this L tells you the average distance between a random bike and the nearest replenishment location. That way you can estimate roughly what is your rebalancing effort. And so here is the so-called fleet conversation condition. Now, B is number of bikes in the system. N, small n, is the total parking time or the idle bikes. So this is bikes that are there waiting to be used. The second part is the bikes that are being used. So this is occupied biking time. Third part is the bikes that are being rebalanced. The bikes are en route for rebalancing. So if you add the three parts together, it has to equals to total bike time. All right, that's the idea. Well, so I think we're ready to give you the market equilibrium model, okay, with all these conditions. So the first one tells you the upper bound of the bike trip length. The second one is the lower bound of the bike trip length. And we also have the access time, right? How much time you're gonna need to find a bike. We have the bike demand. We have the conservation of bike time. This is the formula that I presented in the previous slide. And finally, we have the rebalancing bike trip length. That's how much time, how much distance you have to travel in order to rebalance each bike. And last one is unique location function. Okay. I think I'm going to skip this to analytical result. I don't think it's very important. Let me just go to the data and calibration. We're going to now I'm going to show you the data and how we're going to calibrate the model. So we take this data from Chengdu, and the Chengdu. This is the city of Chengdu. This is the city center. This is where we study. This area roughly has close to 500 kilometer area, and within that area lives about 4 million people. In 2018, there was 1.1 million bikes in that area. Okay, unique bikes. Since then, city of Chengdu had tried to cap the fleet size. In May of 2019, they capped the fleet at 600,000. And a year later, they reduced that cap to 450,000. Okay. And later we're going to compare our model with that cap and see if that cap is reasonable. And that was my question. That was my question anyway. I always wonder if you put that number there, if that's really a good number, or even if it's a reasonable number. Yes. Yes. The city actually, if you look at the entire Chengdu, they have I think they have 12 million people. But inside this area, they have about 4 million. You think that's too many or too small? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. That's a very densely populated area in China. Now, so we get a data from a large DLB operator in Chengdu, and we have about 43 days of data. Okay, and we identified about 250,000 of unique bike in the data, and in total we recorded about 15 million trips. So that adds up to about 1.5 trips per bike per day. Not a great number if you think about it, right? Each bike only it's only used by but 2 times. And this is average daily ridership in the area. I just want to show you the heat map. This is, you can see that interestingly, this bike, this is a daily pattern, and you can see there's unique peak hour pattern. The peak is around 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. So let me explain. I think it's important how we calibrate the unique location function, right? So we divide the city into 240 sub areas. We call it traffic analysis zones, and we divide the 43 days into 20,000. I mean 2,000 time intervals, each about 30 minutes. And now for each of those time slot, we first find out what is idle number. The idle bikes, N. Okay. Those are the bikes that are not moved within the interval, so we consider the idle. They're waiting there. Now we also we apply a modified DB scan clustering algorithm to find the unique bike locations. Right. So we get N tilde. We get N and then we get N tilde, and that's for one space-time slot. We have 240 times 2,000 time slots. So we put all these numbers together and we try to do a regression and find out the relationship. Let's just give you an example of the so for instance, for this area, for a particular time period, we have 474 bikes that are idle there. And eventually our clustering algorithm come up with 49 unique locations. So that's a rough ratio that gave you a sense of how you actually reduce number of bikes to the number of unique locations. We try different functions, right? So those are the original data. So you put all these dots in. So this is bike density. This is location density. And you can see how as your number of bikes increase, the number of locations increase as well. And you can try to fit the data with different functions. We try linear function, we try logarithm, we try power law, and we eventually found power law seems to fit well. This is a red line, okay? It provides a relatively good fit. It has nice analytical properties, and also it's very popular, right? Power law is very popular. We use power law to describe a lot of physical phenomena, like winner take all, for instance, right? We use power law. So we choose that. I don't think there's a function that is here that you cannot say, okay. So here's what is the current situation in Chengdu. Okay, and you can see in Chengdu, it's somewhere. Chengdu's current situation lies somewhere here. So you have about 1,200 bikes per kilometer, and the rough location is like 25, 26. That's what's going on in Chengdu. Okay, so trip length distribution. This is a very important input, right? So we have to know the trip length distribution in order to get demand, but we don't really know what's the trip length distribution in Chengdu. So we look at the US DOT travel survey, national travel survey, and we took that plot, right? So that's all types of trips, and so we get a trip length distribution. We took that, and we sort of find the we fit a function. I think they found it fits reasonably well with the exponential distribution. So that's what we use as our trip length distribution for the input. Or there's a lot of parameters. I don't think I need to go over all these parameters, but I just want to know there are things that we observe from data. For instance, the biking speed we can observe directly from data. Rebalancing frequency, alpha, we can observe from data. There are things that we cannot observe from data, but we can somehow come up with the idea, like roughly estimated based on public information, like walking speed, for instance, value of time, right? We estimate doing public available information. Now, we use those information and we try to calibrate the parameters that we don't know how to estimate. There are things that we don't really know how to estimate. For instance, we don't know how to estimate the fixed driving cost. We don't really know how to estimate the rebalancing speed, right? Because we don't really know what the rebalancing, because it's very complicated. Most importantly, we don't know what is total demand. We have to estimate total demand. Eventually, we estimate the total demand is at 162,000 per hour. Now, go ahead. Rebalancing frequency is the ratio between the number of trips, number of bike trips, and number of rebalancing trips. Rebalancing speed is how fast you travel to rebalance the bike. Like our model will tell you the distance. Right, exactly. The speed is actual speed. So this has to do with your the time that you will spend on rebalancing. That has to do with rebalancing cost estimation. So we calibrate these three parameters by trying to fit the equilibrium model to these three numbers. Because we know the hourly ridership. We find that we have data. We know average trip distance, right? We also know the bike utilization ratio. We have all these three numbers. So we try to twist our parameters so that these general statistics will be replicated. That's what we mean by calibration. We calibrate it. We calibrate three critical parameters we don't really know how to calibrate. Finally, but I just want to point out the average rebalancing distance, we actually didn't use it for calibration. So we didn't try to match it. But eventually our model actually produced a rebalancing distance that's matched with observation reasonably well. So our model produced 1.0 kilometers per rebalancing trip. The observation here in our reference is about 1.1. Okay, so I think that's an indication that our model generate results reasonably well. I just want to say the bike data actually tell us the share of the bike is about 30%. That sounds very high, right? I think there's a number of reasons why we have such a high biking mode share. One is that I think we underestimate the total demand likely because our trip length was taken from US, so the trip length may be off. Another reason is that we underestimate the competition from transit. Because we lump everything together into a motorized mode, and therefore we underestimate the share of transit. So I think most likely we overestimate the share of biking. We don't know really how much. Okay, but I guess when you have a very simple model, sometimes it's hard to separate the very detailed stuff. Now, we have done three counterfactuals, right? So first one is profit maximization. So we try to imagine the operator try to maximize the revenue. So the total revenue minus the maintenance cost, the bike, and then rebalancing cost, and subject to the equilibrium constraints and the non-native constraints. I'm gonna skip this one. I think I'm gonna skip this one without time. And the second counterfactual is we assume that the operator will try to maximize ridership. So maximize QB, that's the number of bike trips. And in this one, we actually assume that the profit will be non-negative, right? So we don't allow the operators to lose money, basically. And finally, there's a social welfare maximization. This is city's perspective, right? And here we try to, so in order to maximize social welfare here, it's equivalent to minimize the total cost. So there's there's operator's cost, there's a traveler's walking traveler's cost, there's biking cost, and there's driving cost. You add all the costs together, and together with the operator's cost, you get the total cost. We have analytical results. Without getting into detail, I just want to explain. We found that analytically, you can show that in most cases, maximizing social welfare will lead to the highest fleet size, lowest price. So if the city wants to maximize social welfare, they will try to give as many bikes as possible, but lower the price as much as possible. This is generally, this is true even for compared to ridership maximization proposition. Okay, but there's a catch. The when the profit requirement in the ridership maximization is very low, then what I just said may be not right. These two relationships will be reversed. Anyway, so I think I'm going to go to the case study and present you some results. So we compare here 4 cases, right? So the last one, this is our status quo, and you can see the status quo. We have 600,000 bikes. 600 bikes. That is the cap. That is the cap of the city. Okay. And now if you compare with 1, 2, and 3, and you quickly realize the current situation, the cap is way too high. And you can see if you want to maximize profit, you only need about 60,000. It's about 10% of what the city allows them to do. If you want to maximize ridership, the number of bikes should be roughly 1/6. Okay, so 100,000, not 600,000. And if you want to, even if you want to maximize social welfare, that's the highest you can go. You only need about 120,000. So 600,000 certainly too high. And the current number, which is 450,000, is still about 3.5 times as much as what our social welfare maximization says. But you have to remember, our model is likely to overestimate bike sharing's appeal. So therefore, the number of, the bikes numbers are likely to be higher than what actually is. So this is our upper bound. Yep.
Data that you just actually,
You can talk to that.
Hear me? Okay. The data that you used was from one operator.
Yes, we scaled up.
Oh, you scaled up.
The operator, we estimate that the operator has about 60% of market share. So we scale up everything. We assume that everybody have similar performance. Thank you for that question. Now here's, sorry, oops, sorry. I think I go back to the end. So here's I think the key insight here. If you look at access time, you realize that when you have 600,000 bikes out there, your access time is about 2 minutes. But when you only have 60,000 bikes, your access time is higher, but it's really not that much higher. It's 2.5, 2.6 minutes. Why is that? Why all this? Why, the startups, they think if only they can provide, you can scale up their fleet, they can provide so much convenience. They can shorten their access time so much. That's actually not the case. But because the bikes, they naturally congregate, they naturally form unique locations. And unique location is naturally much smaller than the number of bikes. And so when you actually when you throw that many bikes on the street, you don't really help that much in terms of access, right? So you don't really get much of the bang on your buck, so to speak, right? That's I think that's the key insight here. That by putting too many bikes on there, the startups, they didn't help themselves that much. Another important observation I wish to make is that if you compare 2 and 3, number 2 is to maximize ridership. Number 3 is maximize social welfare. If you compare them, you can see they're very similar in terms of performance. If you look at access time, if you look at average trip distance, utilization, ridership, very similar. Ridership is lower, slightly lower, right? However, this number 2, it does not run a deficit. Deficit is 0. Here you run a very high deficit. Question. Ridership is the number of people use bikes. Okay. So we think that in fact the P2 try to maximize the ridership is actually a better idea, perhaps, compared to social welfare. Because if you want to maximize social welfare, you really have to put a lot of money on the table by the city, by the taxpayers. I'm not sure taxpayers is willing to do that. Okay. Now this is a sort of a this is a 2-dimensional view, and you can see here x-axis is fare, y-axis is the fleet size, and you can see the this one, right? That is your status quo. This is your maximize. This point is where you maximize profit. Those 2 points are where you you maximize ridership or social welfare. And you can easily say that, in fact, the current state strikes very poor balance between the conflicting objectives, right? It has the lowest profit, but it is not doing that well on the ridership or social welfare. So we ask the question. I think this is going to be, what can the operator do in terms of choice of policies, right? So that's the question we're going to ask. The regulator, they have 2 options. They can either control price, they can control fleet. I don't think you can control both, because if you control both, there's nothing the operator can do, right? Operator wouldn't do it if you control both. Now, if the regulator, they can try to maximize bike ridership or social welfare. The operator, they can also choose maximize profit or ridership, regardless what the regulator wants them to do, right? So if you're an operator, if you want to gain dominance on the market, you may want to maximize ridership, right? So you want to gain as many users. This is typically happen when you are expanding. When you just enter the market, you want to expand. But you can also, at some point, you want to maximize profit. So you can switch between these 2 objectives. So our question is, depending on the objective of the operator, what the regulator should do. Okay. Now, so I draw this diagram. So the first row is operator aims to maximize the profit. The bottom row is the maximization of ridership. This is for the operator. Okay. Now, this is a regulator's policy. On the left is fleet control. That means the regulator try to control the fleet size. On the right is the regulator try to control the price. Okay. So if you look at the, for instance, the left, if you compare the left, look at the left one, the left axis representing ridership, that's a black line. The right one representing the social welfare, it's a red line. Okay, so this is what happened when regulator try to control fleet, but operator try to maximize profit. The right-hand side, the plot, is when the regulator try to control the price and operator try to maximize profit. Now, if you compare left and right, you can clearly say the right side is better because the lines are higher. You see both ridership, especially social welfare, is much higher on the right compared to the left. So we say that in this case, when operator try to maximize profit, the regulator should try to control price. Okay, they should try to control price. And in fact, you can almost observe from the plot what will be the optimum price range. It should range between 25 cents to 50 cents. That's a sweet spot. That's where you will help the system the most by setting the price control. Okay, that's where the price should land. This is assuming the operator wants to maximize profit. Now, what if the operator wants to maximize ridership? And now you have a very different story. If you compare left and right, you can easily say that the best should happen on the left, right? Because the social welfare is so much higher than on the right, right? And you can also identify this is going to be the range for the fleet size, because they make a reasonable trade-off between ridership and social welfare, right? So from this plot, we can conclude that regulators' policy will be dependent on the operators' objective. In different phases of the development of the bike sharing programs, the regulator should try different objectives as well. The policy should be set differently. Well, so I think I'm going to skip the slides. I think I'm running out of time. I don't think these are. We have done some sensitivity analysis, but I think these results can I can skip those results. Let me just jump to conclusions. So the first finding, I think that answered our question. We found that the current fleet cap set by Chengdu City, which is 450,000 K, sorry, 450 K, should be cut by at least 75%, right? So that's way too high, in our opinion. It's way too high. You have to remember, once again, we tend to overestimate the bike sharing fleet. So in order to avoid severe oversupply and waste, you should definitely lower that cap dramatically. That probably applies to many Chinese cities. And we found that maximize ridership is a good strategy, so to speak, right? Because you will keep the price at an affordable level, but you also maintain the revenue neutrality. But you will also raise the ridership and social welfare close to system optimum. We also found, as I have just explained, the effectiveness of the regulators' policy depends on the operator's objective. If the operator focus on profit, we should try to limit price, right? If the aim is to gain market position, if the operator wants to dominate the market, so that they try to expand, they are doing expansion, then the regulator should come in and set a fleet cap. Well, so those are the main findings. Let me just quickly comment on what future research might look like. There's obviously the angle of competition between the platforms. At the beginning of the lecture, at the beginning of the seminar, I said it was competition that drove the market crazy, right? But we didn't do competition here. We're studying a very different mechanism. We haven't really quite figured out how you can model this dynamics so that the oversupply become a result of a competition, right? But I'm sure there is a mechanism there. We are working on this. This one, I think we should be able to have a very quick follow-up. But there are other things that we haven't really figured out how to do. For instance, how do we make the rebalancing operations more realistic? And the current assumption, I realize, is not ideal. It's something that we have to do in order to simplify, but it's not ideal. So looking for more realistic rebalancing option is the next step. And last but not least, I think the uniform distribution of demand is not really, I don't really like that assumption, because it take away many important features of bike sharing system. But we haven't really figured out how you could consider demand heterogeneity in such a model. So with that, I think I'm gonna stop. I apologize for being a little rushed and toward the end. So here we have a paper. It's currently under revision and translation science. But we have put on a preprint on SSR, and so if you're interested, you can look it up. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco. Apologies. Our hours, we had to make you rush due to the technical glitches. But anyway, so for those who can still stay here for a few minutes, we could entertain couple of questions. From if you're online, you can put it to the chat box or yeah. So Dr. John,
Can online students hear me or online attendees hear me? I opened
good.
my phone. Okay, good. So great study. I mean, great research. I just have a couple questions. I think one you have already mentioned because I was thinking along the presentation, I was thinking about the competition among the different operators because that always happens. And also, I think that probably has a lot of effect on the pricing. Once you have the competition, nobody can be monopolize the price, right? So
you become a sort of Nash equilibrium. I mean, Nash game, Nash equilibrium game. We are working on that. I think we'll definitely produce follow up. We have some ideas how we're going to do that. It's going to be a Nash equilibrium, and we know how to model. We just don't know what the results will look like.
Okay, that's great. I look forward to hearing more. And another thing is about when I look at those are like a more detailed question is about driving speed.
Yes.
Right, because you have
which driving speed? The driving mode.
Yeah, when you have the driving mode, you look into a composite, motorized mode, right? And then you show it's similar as the traffic pattern that we have. So we have peak hours and non-peak hours, and then you cut the time into 30 minutes time window. But you used just the one driving speed parameter.
True. Absolutely. That's so we only when we calibrate we cut it. But when we using the demand model, we assumed every it's same everywhere. I don't think because of the nature of our model, we cannot afford to sort of capture that kind of traffic dynamics like congestion patterns. We have to assume that the travel speed are.
So you are saying you cannot give different driving speed for different time of the day?
We can, because our model doesn't really have a time index per se. I guess, I mean, you can do that. I just don't, yeah, that's good. I mean, that may be a good idea. Initially, we don't think that complexity would justify sort of the cost. I don't know if that much detail will buy you a lot. Like you have a dynamic model basically in this case.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of drive a lot about why we have high demand in those peak hours, right?
Because of the people try to avoid congestion. That's a good point. Absolutely, I agree. That might be behind the peaking effect. Interesting. I think we might be able to try a dynamic model. It's not. It's always about the balance between complexity and I guess.
I think it does not have to be dynamic. It's just it's
multi-period,
still deterministic, just with a different
time periods.
Yes.
But then you have to link them. Like you have to have the demand. I don't know if you have to consider sort of demand distributed between different time intervals then, because otherwise it's not a true time dependent model per se.
Okay.
But yeah, I never thought about that. But thank you for bringing that up. I thought that's an interesting direction to go for sure.
I know other attendees may have questions, but I have a last one. So also, have you thought about induced demand? Because when you have higher supply, it may introduce more desired trips. So
total Q0 could go up.
Yes. With that, certainly we can look into if that induced demand is significant or not, and then we can justify why not include it there. But I was thinking, have you thought about that?
You could, I mean, you could, you can generate, but the question is how do you calibrate the model then? We currently, I frankly, I don't really have much faith on the total demand that we got. It's, I feel it's a little low. It's kind of too low because we have 4 million people, but we only have like 160 trips per hour. To me, I feel that's definitely too low. We didn't get the total demand right for sure because we don't get the transit. So I think until we can get that right, if you add more complexity into the model, I'm not sure you can actually make it more useful. I guess that's I fully agree that the elasticity is an important aspect. It's just when you are trying to do this kind of modeling, you have to get rid of a lot of things.
Sure, of course.
Sometimes we don't know which one, which card is right or which card is not right.
Sure.
You have to just try.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's excellent questions.
Thank you.
Other questions? I saw. Sure. Well, I saw a comment from Brett Mannering. He said, "Sorry, I arrived late because of previous appointment. I will watch the recording and contact you if he has questions." Well, thanks, Brad, for that. Other comments, questions? So yeah, I have a question. Let's say, when you're talking about, I'm trying to understand that replenish location. That's until that looks like the cost is gonna decrease as increase of until that, right? It looks like both the
You mean the rebalancing cost?
both the rebalancing cost and the walking cost. Is that right? I think until they're on the denominator and that square root term. I could be wrong.
We just go.
Slide 16, I think it's. Not sure if I can back it up. There, it may take a while, but I'm just, yeah. So,
This one?
yeah, and Toyota, yeah. That's 16, and the.
Is this one? This is rebalancing.
Right.
Lens.
Rebalance, and you have another walking cost, right?
Walking cost is separate. Walking cost. Oh, you mean access time?
Access cost, right?
Yes, access time
That
is
is
here.
also, until that's over there. So,
Correct.
so why not we make until the maximum?
What do you mean?
Is how to decide? Can we make until that variable? Like that? If that's the case, we can make until the
Until that
maximum
is a variable.
is a variable.
Yes.
And if it is variable, how about we make it until that equal n, or I don't know. So maximize that.
You mean maximize?
Maximize until that may decrease the total system cost,
But
right?
you are not trying to only minimizing the access cost, right? You are trying to maximize profit. So we try to maximize profit by choosing price and fleet size, and price and fleet size will impact Toyota through a very complex relationship, because because your fleet size will say your fleet size will interact with N through this relationship. So this is your decision verb.
Okay.
And this decision will impact N, and N will impact Toyota through that function. But Toyota will then impact A, but A is also here. A will impact the usage.
So yeah.
So everything is actually entangled here. When we send to transportation science, the reviewers' efforts like, you have come up with such a simple model. Why can't you do more analysis? Why can't you give us more nice, juicy analytical results? But we tried very hard. We tried really hard. We thought, this is so simple. Why can't we do it more elegantly? But we can't. The analytical results, relationship was really messy, very messy.
Yeah, you can use graphs to show some.
Yeah, we can do numerical analysis, but when it comes to analyze, I think we really have relatively limited capability.
Yeah. So another thing is about the heterogeneity, spatial and temporal heterogeneity.
Yep.
So, right. So like spatial heterogeneity, some places are attracting demands, some places are, absorbing the demands, and the temporal heterogeneity is related to what Dr. John's saying. You have congestion and tidal effects.
Yes.
Those could
Absolutely
maybe increase the needs of the vehicles.
You have a huge impact on how you actually do operation on the ground. I mean, there's all these people. I think you have done this yourself. I try to do rebalance. It's very hard to do, and the level of operations research, right? So you have to do you have to know the dynamic demand. You have to address them. You have to move the bikes around at the right time. With this model, I'm not sure. I hope we can find a way to address that heterogeneity.
Yeah.
It would be nice to do that.
Can you simplify to use a few parameters to capture the heterogeneity?
Like you have like A and B, and do A.
Yeah, something very simple, and then you can run some simulation or optimization to
that would be a extension that I can ask my students to try.
Right.
We have done that. We have done that for taxi, right? We have done that for taxi. Like one of my students had done like ride a hill, and we consider A and B, and consider demand heterogeneity. It could work. It's just if you once you've done that, you can have even less analytical results. We have some analytical results. I didn't have time to get into, but if you once you do that, you almost completely lost your ability to
Right.
generate insights. I think that it's like a very hard
Yeah.
balance.
Sometimes even if you don't have analytical results, but if you can plot nice figures,
Yeah.
even the numerical results are
True.
like clean, and then that has lots of insights to the policy making.
Absolutely, I agree. It's just if you want to publish in Transmitting Science, they will say, this
Yeah, we
is,
could change our people's views on how to
yeah,
select the good papers to publish.
yeah, it's interesting. Like we saw this is would fit Transmitting Science reasonably well, but turns out the reviewers are like, we like the idea, we think it's novel, but can you give us more analytical results? We're like, we have tried our best. We're still revising the paper in order to add more analytical results. And it turns out we have to do even more simplification in order to generate insights. So anyway, that's a.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any. Okay.
I
All right.
have-
Look.
I have one more question and one more comment. So one question is about, you mentioned the third generation, fourth generation, and some of the programs actually they sell the membership,
Yeah.
like a monthly membership,
Right.
annual membership.
Yes.
How that will affect the setting of your problem?
We haven't done. I mean, in fact, you will notice that we estimate the per unit price. We actually estimate that based on membership fee. So we like. Now I don't remember the detail, but we take the membership fee and we estimate the average trip distance per user. So we can get that from data. We know on average each person how many bike trips they generate, even if they have the membership. So we can estimate per mile, actual per mile cost for them. That's our way to do it. But I agree with you. I think in reality, the decision-making process is more complex than we consider here, because once you have membership, you don't really think about, it's not like you are not making individual choices. Once you're in, you always try to use bike sharing, right? So that's totally different dynamics. I don't, our model, I don't think we can capture that that effect authentically. Definitely not in this form.
One comment is that actually U.S. didn't follow China or didn't tight the regulation because they observe what happened in China.
That's
U.S.
good. Thank you.
always
Always
tied to the regulation. I think only the exception case is Uber.
Okay.
Other than
Thank
that,
you.
yeah, whenever the city is doing, because way before 2016, OFO started in Beijing, while I'm working with the local cities, or when I'm communicating with other cities, the regulator actually play a really important role in the bike sharing
So
programs.
they're always like we have to have a limit.
Yeah, we need to have some control so to avoid the problems that actually lately occurred in China or other countries.
So they anticipate what's going to happen if you like control freak.
Right.
Thank you. I will fix that. I saw it almost that it was having saying what's happening in China.
Of course.
So they are better at the regulation. That's
right.
it.
Yep.
Thanks. Yes, go ahead. Okay. We don't. That's a good question.
Can you repeat the question?
Well, so the question was in Chengdu, there's the locations are, I guess the space are limited. So there may be a capacity in terms of unique location, like how many bikes you could place at a unique location. Now we don't have that. It would be nice to have that feature though. In our case, we actually calibrate the unique location from data. So we so in terms of the number of bikes, including a unique location, is actually a reflection of what actually happening on the ground. So whatever we observe, I don't know if that's reasonable. Perhaps it was not reasonable, but that's what we observed in the year of 2000 at least. So
I think the space is there because the bicycles were there.
yeah,
The only thing is some of them were illegally parked. That's the question.
that's what I'm saying.
Problem.
It may not be reasonable. Like, in the data may be unreasonable, but we observe them and we take it as input. Whether or not we should cap it, it will definitely make the model harder, much more complicated, and also it's very hard to impose a unique capacity because I guess every location is different. Some location can hold up to 30, some can hold up to 5. It's very hard to capture that effect. But I think that's a good. And whenever you have a simple model, there's always all these questions. I appreciate the questions, but sometimes you as a modeler, you always face the very hard question of what realism I have to cut off from a model. And whenever I do that, I have to think, oh, gee, what I should explain to my reader that this is actually makes sense. It's always that's a painful process. But I think that's the problem that every modeler will have to face.
Well, I much enjoy the discussion. Hope this continues, but we're supposed to start our launch with a speaker at this time. So I want to, if you have further questions, please feel free to drop me or Dr. Nia an email about it. So, next week, we're going to have Dr. J from the University of California, Irvine, visiting us. So he's also going to talk about shared mobility of connected automated vehicles. So please stay tuned. With this, let's thank Dr. Nia again, and let's give him a.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you.